Welcome to Don't Fear the Weight podcast with your host Vicky Masita, bringing together science and personal experience.
Hi guys, welcome to the brand new episode of the, what shall we call it today? No, it is the Don't Fear the Weight podcast. I know that I have been AWOL for such a long time, but I have been massively busy, but no excuses. So I am back. As you can see, I am in the spinning chair of peace with a big hot water bottle behind me because I was in that horrible car accident yesterday. So apologies for sitting down and not being my big lively self. However, sitting down in another twizzly chair of peace is my guest today by the name of Mr. Calum, who is a muscle mentor. Calum, how are you, my man?
I'm good, thank you. I'm actually on a wooden stool, but I'll pretend it's a swizzly chair. That's fine.
You can say that it's a twizzly chair. We don't have to pretend here. Or you can be on a wooden stool of peace. That's fine. That's fine. I am very surprised that you're managing to sit on a wooden stool of peace without it breaking because you are so massive. So, you know, not like me. I can, you know, I can have like 17 of me and the chairs will still be able to take my weight because I'm so tiny. So we are complete opposites. But anyway, moving on and me stop being an arsehole for once. Tell everybody who you are and what you're all about and why I'm so excited to speak to you today.
So if some people may know me through affiliation with AJ, obviously I've been on AJ's podcast before. We converse a lot through social media. But essentially the brand itself now, the Muscle Mentors, is a collaboration between 4 people. It was originally me and Luke Hoffman, who some people will know as well. Again, I think he's podcasting with AJ today. And I was previously known as CR Physique, which was my coaching company before. Luke was Biophysiques. We've merged those together to become the Muscle Mentors as a collaboration. And then we've just taken on 2 more coaches, James and Ryan, who are coming on board now. So now it is a 4. And we are essentially just a UK-based physique / body composition coaching service and consultancy who will run both the coaching element and the educational element. So it's kind of taking physique optimization and health optimization and merging them both together, really.
Amazing. Now, that's really one of the reasons why I wanted to bring you on here is because of the simple fact that you do take health markers very, very, very seriously, don't you?
Yeah, yeah.
And one of the biggest things that I'm seeing in the industry quite recently is women still, unfortunately, getting ground to almost to death trying to make it to the stage and health really not being at the primary. So this is why we were going to have this chat today about females and bodybuilding. So as we are talking to a muscle mentor, let's actually dive a little bit more into the off season for women. So if a woman comes to you and let's just say from the ground up, she is really wanting to compete, but she's in no kind of state at the moment because she hasn't got the kind of muscle mass that she wants to have, where would you really kind of guide her and looking at the health markers as well at that point? What would you be looking for?
So like when it comes to like a male individual, male physiology tends to be physically more resilient than a female. Females are typically mentally more resilient than males in terms of they can typically endure preps more efficiently than a male can in terms of their ability to just bottle up and just crack on.
Sure.
Now, female physiology is very fragile when it is pushed to the extremes, and we're going to start to see more adversity in regards to their health when these extremes are exposed to these individuals. And we've got to remember the fact that taking the body to the extremes and to the extremes of body composition in terms of being very, very lean, or to take the body into a place where we're trying to maximize the accrual of lean tissue to the greatest extent we can. Like this stuff, when we look at how the body wants to function and live, it's going away from where the body wants to be in terms of that homeostatic environment. It wants to be, you know, can survive, can plod along and be present. It doesn't want to go to the extreme. So there's always going to be hurdles that we need to jump across. And for a female, in terms of that kind of, whether you want to call it like a priming phase or whether you want to call it just the importance of the off season and actually spending time getting physiology and getting the body and getting the mind as well in the best possible place to diet. Like, that is the most important aspect that people need to take into consideration before they enter, whether it's a comp prep, whether it's a photo shoot prep, whether it's someone dieting for a holiday. Like, the more extreme the body composition, the more extreme the approach. But generally speaking, like, the better we can make that priming phase in terms of safeguarding and kind of building these solid foundations, the more efficient that process will be in terms of generating the fat loss we want, retaining the lean tissue we want, retaining the performance through prep that we want to see. And for the most part, the key variables that we'll be looking at are one's ability to maximize stress management. And stress management comes into a couple of things. So stress management can be more from a psychological perspective and an emotional perspective, but it also comes from the perspective of stress on the body and stress from a physiology perspective. So that can be environmental stresses, lifestyle stresses, work, relationships. Training is a stress that we need to account for. Volume is a stress that we need to account for. And these things mismanaged will start to create issues long term. Sleep is going to be something that we want to try and maximize. The quality of nutrition and the intricacies with someone's diet is going to be something we want to try and maximize. So not just looking at calories as kind of an arbitrary figure where we're just giving someone macros and calories to hit. It's looking at the actual details in terms of how those calories are comprised and the foods that we're eating and those foods and their ability to actually meet our needs in regards to nutrition. And from a female health perspective, like, the individuality with nutrition plays a really important role in things like menstrual function and key systems in the female body that needs to function properly. And nutrition comes into that big time. It's not just about calories. I think that the big ones that are neglected are going to be the quality of nutrition. The big one for us, just from experience, will just be stress management and sleep, are two things that are very poorly managed. And for the most part, what do you see when a female enters a comp prep type scenario? They'll jack their output up and they'll pull their food down super quickly. And variables that don't need to be changed all at once and that abruptly, but also variables that massively increase the stress load on the body and limit your ability to basically sustain a responsive environment for long periods of time in prep. And it won't be long before that starts to crash and burn.
Absolutely. In terms of actually the off season, when you're or say like a priming phase, for example, do you find that you have more women who have a lot of gut stresses and bloating issues actually when you're giving them more and more macros and more calories going in to actually gain the muscle tissue?
Yeah, so like that. So when we look at the first initial stage of coaching, it'll be very rare when somebody comes to us already in like an optimal state of health. When we look at those variables in play, there'll always be something we can improve, but because of the depths that we go to, we're starting to probably get inquiries from a specific type of person that wants that attention to detail and needs to address specific things, which is cool. But it goes the same for males, but when it comes to females as well, like obviously accruing tissue is going to be a very metabolically expensive process, which is going to require a good amount of food, and training volume is obviously going to be something that output in general is going to be something that we need to basically take into consideration when we look at how much food is actually going to be required. Their level of tissue is going to be coming into that as well, the training intensity, etc. But any kind of increases in calories is going to create stress and create burden on the digestive tract and the GI. And when we look at digestive irregularities, whether that's bloating, gas, flatulence, it could be kind of irregularities in motility. So like someone's consistency and quality and frequency of their stools. Typically, these are things that we commonly see being relatively adverse and impacted when stress is high. And stress is the biggest thing when we look at GI function. Like a lot of people will think when they start to see these symptoms in prep, or when they start to push food up high and they start to see these symptoms, that it is the food that's creating the issues, or they're eating inflammatory foods, or it's because I'm having Greek yogurt, or it's because I'm having whey and I must be reacting to whey. Whey must be inflammatory. But when we look at the kind of the breakdown and the processes of breakdown of food, if somebody's come to our seminars or somebody's heard our podcast or whatever, we're hot on talking about the nervous system, and particularly the autonomic nervous system's ability to regulate a lot of these processes in the body and from a physiological perspective. And we've got this this seesaw of sympathetic and parasympathetic. We want to have the ability to regulate both of those things. And there'll be periods of time, for example, during the training window where stress is going to be welcomed because we need to perform and we need to be in that state where performance is maximized. But away from training, we want to try and maximize the ability for us to remain parasympathetic. And that is basically the side of us where resting heart rate is at its lowest point, and we are in that kind of rest and digest state. And in that state, resting heart rate is low, stress is being managed, and the body can function. And when stress is high and we're in this sympathetic state, there'll be certain intricacies and systems in the body itself. So the digestive tract is one of the big ones, where when we've got blood being distributed to other extremities and to tissues when stress is high, blood is going to be something that supports gastrointestinal secretions. So when we look at our ability to secrete endogenously, so our ability, not taking a supplement, our ability to secrete things like saliva, pancreatic enzymes in the saliva, or acids and enzymes in the small intestine to break down the food in the first place. Like chewing is our first mechanical process of food breakdown.
Yeah.
When we swallow that food and we've chewed it, ideally in a semi-liquid state, once we swallow that food, we're going to require these acids and enzymes to break down this food. And when stress is high, our ability to secrete these key ingredients that will break down food is severely limited, which means that food breakdown is now limited, which means that creates a certain level of inflammation through that digestive process. So like the really cool thing when you look at taking people from a position where they're experiencing a lot of irregularities with digestive function is like, don't look at the diet yet, don't look at the foods they're eating yet. If you look at the bigger picture and look at stress and sleep first, if those two bigger things have been addressed, everything else will follow. And then if there's still little things that we can adjust from a nutritional perspective, you can go in at that level. But the biggest thing first is it's got to be stress management and their ability to what we call regulate that autonomic side. So their ability to maximize stress management at times away from scheduled stress. And scheduled stress would be like the training window, for example.
For sure, for sure. So it's interesting that you would say that, because we're actually looking at putting somebody in a very, very stressful environment, which is their training window, of course. But then post-training, you want them to be very, very parasympathetic and be able to digest their post-workout nutrition very, very well.
Yep.
But if their levels of stress are very high when we want them in that training window, and then you want them to eat, say, 45 minutes to 60 minutes after that training window, do you do like the whole I'm going to have a protein shake straight afterwards to increase muscle protein synthesis? Or do you just kind of say, actually, just go home, chill out for a little bit, then make your food, and once you get into that state, then you can eat?
Like even like regardless of whether this is around the training window, post-workout, pre-workout, regardless of the time of day, like we'll have certain things that we give clients where they'll have like strategies pre-feeding or pre-meal to implement before a mealtime. So if somebody is in a place where we know that allostatic load or like their environmental stresses are high, psychological stress is high, physical stress is high, and we can track these things through things like resting heart rate, HRV, etc. When we know that these things are present, we'll start to give them actionable habits that they put in pre-meal to lower resting heart rate and to lower stress response and create more of a parasympathetic environment before they eat. And one of the easiest ways of starting to track that from a metrics perspective is resting heart rate is a telltale sign. When resting heart rate is elevated, we're going to be exposed to some form of stress response. And heart rate variability will be one that we want to track upon waking, but is quite hard to pinpoint during the day. So like post-workout is a time where we'll get people to track their resting heart rate or current heart rate after they train, and they'll know where their normal baseline resting heart rate will be away from training, so they know what they need to get down to. And we'll basically just say, we don't want you to eat until you've achieved that resting heart rate be like below your current. So say it's what's your resting heart rate at the moment? Do you know?
57. So
57. So if you hover at like 55 to 60 for most of the day, and after your workout, you're resting, your heart rate is at 80 beats per minute. But you wouldn't eat that post-workout meal until you're back down to your normal baseline. And when you're back down to that normal baseline, we can pretty much guarantee that the body's in a pretty sufficient place to take on board food and digest and assimilate that food. But people rushing into a meal, whether it's a shake, whether it's a whole food, which will be even worse, like we're wasting opportunities where we can maximize the absorption of nutrients. And realistically, if we're taking on board food in times where digestion and assimilation is compromised, then we're creating more stress for the GI tract and more inflammation that will then need to be managed later down the line.
Yeah, definitely. That's really cool, actually. And I've always said, like, some of my clients, they always kind of tell me that their gut is so finical, and the gut is very fickle. It's kind of scared of everything. You know, if you're overtraining, you don't go to the toilet, you know, and you can be really, really backed up. And for a woman, that's quite harsh, especially if they're coming up to a time of the month and their menstrual cycle is impacting their bloating as well. That to be accompanied with like maybe a 3-day bloat because they're overstressed. I mean, I can take it as my perfect example. I was in a car accident yesterday and I got whiplash in my lower lumbar of my back, and I'm in a lot of pain with it. So I just kind of sat down to my regular lunchtime meal and I was struggling to eat it purely for the simple fact that I was so bloated because my gut is under so much stress because of the pain that I'm in. So it's interesting realistically for you to gauge you know, the habits of the bowel and the parasympathetic nervous system and any kind of external stresses that do that, because to actually have a look at the heart rate variability and your resting heart rate before you start eating, that's a really, really good cue. And I really want people to take that on board because that's a really good gold dust information from there. Okay, so moving on from that then, what would you say are the primary health markers in terms of blood work that you have a look at with females? Do you ask your females, let's look from a natural perspective, do you ask your natural competitors to actually have some baseline bloods done?
So blood work comes into more specific use when we're looking at assisted individuals, whether that's male or female. And obviously female assistance is going to be a lot less prevalent than male assistance. And that is an essential tool for an assisted athlete to track those metrics, because that's essentially the only way that we know for certain that we've got tangible data on what's happening from a health perspective that's underlying from stuff that we can't track from metrics like heart rate variability, etc. Blood pressure will tell us quite a lot, but there's no way we're going to know like triglycerides, cholesterol, HDL, LDL just from tracking systolic and diastolic blood pressure. Now, like for normal clients that aren't assisted and that are going to be running this from the perspective of being completely natural, blood work can still have massive value, but the frequency in which we probably need to run that will be less. And if a client came on board that was unassisted, I would use these easier, accessible and cheaper metrics first, because they're super easy. They're all cheap. Heart rate monitor is like 40 quid. Most of the apps are free. You know, a blood pressure cuff's probably £20. We can get everything for under £100, whereas a good panel might be £150. It's a one-off payment.
Sure.
Now, like most people that come to us will be willing to invest in this stuff anyway because they're interested and they want to learn more. But it's not something we necessarily push unless there was a reason underlying that we'd feel would be of value for us to see more data when it comes to their current state of health. And male and female blood work, if they're unassisted, like we're looking at the same markers for the most part. For female hormones, obviously you're going to have a slightly different setup in terms of steroid hormones, but when we're looking at hormone testing in general, blood hormone testing is going to be relatively skewed. The most accurate way of measuring that would be through the urine, and through urine analysis, it's a lot more expensive. So if you were to get something like a Dutch test, which will be the most accurate way of following down that chain, it's super expensive. It's super interesting and very, very accurate, but it's very expensive. So that would be like the last resort at the end of the run if something was going off. But you know, like if it were general pop or competitors that were unassisted, like the markers would stay relatively similar, male to female, but the prevalence in which we'd run blood work specifically in terms of the frequency would be high for assisted athletes and low for unassisted. So like to give you a ratio, it might be once every 2 or 3 months for someone that's under the influence of performance enhancing drugs. For someone that's not, it might be once every 6 months or maybe once every quarter, depending on their budget. But it doesn't mean that they're not valuable in both circumstances. It just means that, you know, for someone that, for like yourself, for example, you're going to be a natural competitor. Like you can you can track a lot of your health markers just by doing your resting heart rate, your HRV, your blood pressure, and that basically tells us everything you need to know. If there's something wrong with those things, and there's something we couldn't pinpoint and couldn't act upon from basic lifestyle factors or stress management or sleep, then we can go further down the rabbit hole and look at what's going on.
Yeah, I suppose you could also look at somebody externally and how they visually look as well, can't you?
Yeah, 100%, 100%.
Yeah. I mean, just like the looking of somebody's skin, if they've got like sunken eyes or even dry hair and that kind of thing, or even markers like hair starting to fall out.
Yeah,
that's been quite a prevalent one in the industry recently. I know that I experienced that when I went really low on calories. I started losing my hair. I was like, crap. So that was something, that was a big red flag to kind of sort something out. Okay, so that's obviously the blood work covered in the health markers. So now let's actually get into the nitty gritty of things. I just want to talk about training for this moment in time.
Yep.
Now you said that women can mentally actually deal with the stress a lot more than men. So in terms of the actual volume that you can put a woman under, and as well as gauge that stress response, how would you realistically set up a woman to, let's just do a woman in general, in order to set them up for a really good off season of building a decent amount of muscle tissue overall to create that balance?
Like, I'd probably say 9 times out of 10 for a female consult, there'll be a 90% chance I'll bring their volume down as the first thing I do, because when we bring total workload down, we bring our ability to manage stress up. And that is the most important thing to nail first, because, you know, the management of stress, and when we're spending more time in that rested state, that's where adaptation is occurring. So when we're looking from the perspective of physiological adaptations, neurological adaptations, the good stuff and the stuff that's changing is happening at rest. So for someone that has, like, how prevalent is the kind of the do more, you know, the more is better kind of mindset, in terms of especially the prep mindset in the industry right now, and people want to be the person that's grinding and working hard and feeling like they're working for it. But there comes a point where you just need to be smart about this stuff. And for the most part, female clients will come to me doing too much. There'll be a strong emotional relationship with the amount they're doing, potentially related to body image, or potentially related to, because it's worked in the past, this is how I do things. And generally speaking, like, from a female perspective, changing those habits is much harder than changing them for a male, because they are strong. They have a stronger emotional attachment to what they're doing, and it's very uncomfortable to pull down someone's volume when body image and weight gain and these things are involved in what's going on, which I get. It's like, this is a mental battle, which is why communication is so important and trust is so important. For a male, for most males, you can tell them, this is what I want you to change, and they'll crack on with it, and they have less of an attachment. That's not to say all males don't have that, because I've got some fucking emotional guys. But females wise, it's a little bit harder and a little bit complex to manage at the start. But generally speaking, start of an off season, once we've got these foundations in place, we want to start training in the lowest effective dose. And what I mean by that is, we want to reach a point in your training volume where every session is being progressed in some form of capacity, and you feel like you're recovering. So perceived performance and perceived recovery is going to plan. The logbook is moving forwards. They feel good. They feel refreshed. They don't feel like they're accumulating fatigue. Injury status is low. And then once we reach that point, and it's impossible to say that is X. It's not a tangible thing. It's going to be completely individual, based on their current level of stress, their current intensity, the level of tissue they have, their experience. But that lowest effective dose is the first thing we've got to find. And then as calories increase through an off-season phase, and as their ability to kind of regulate recovery increases, we can potentially push the boat out a little bit more. But generally speaking, off-season will be the time where volume is at its highest. In prep, I kind of flip the switch a little bit. Most people will say, right, I'm going to use volume as a tool in prep to create a fat loss response. I would do the opposite. I'd lower volume in prep when the time comes, because lower volume means we can keep intensity high and we can retain strength, which ultimately means we're going to retain tissue. The higher volume goes in prep, the more junk volume we add in, the lower strength goes, and the lower our ability to retain tissue goes. Because the more volume we add in, it's impossible to maintain performance or volume, lower calories in a greater amount of stress. And this particularly is apparent for unassisted athletes, because when we've got an assisted athlete, we can use drugs to make that kind of lost time up, and we can use drugs to push strength up at those depths of prep where it would normally suffer. For someone unassisted, they need to be very smart about how they're programming volume to maximize their recovery at the depths of prep where they're not going to feel great. And as soon as we lose strength in that environment, we lose the reason why tissue is staying around. So that must be the most important variable to take into consideration. And take your last prep, for example. If I told you to go into the gym for a lower body session, and I told you, right, you're going to do 16 sets, and I want you to do this amount of weight on 16 sets. Or if I told you, right, you're going to do 6 sets, and I want you to bury yourself on every single set. Which one are you going to be more motivated to do, and which one are you going to work harder on?
Probably the 6 sets.
So it's quality over quantity in that scenario.
For sure.
If we can keep intensity high and volume low in that phase, we have the lowest implications on recovery, which means there's more adaptation. We can keep your strength high through prep. Because realistically, a deficit is going to be created through output outside of training, and it's going to be created through nutrition.
Sure.
You adding in a drop set to a lateral raise is doing absolutely nothing to your energy balance long term. Okay, I'd rather you bury your sessions and keep your intensity high with a lower amount of volume than just add sets and sets and sets and sets, because by the end of prep, there's no reason for muscle to stay around.
No, absolutely, because muscle's expensive at the end of the day, isn't it?
Of course.
Yeah, so you've got to feed that muscle in the off season and make sure you're getting enough calories in, like you were just talking about, and work bloody hard in order to create that, to create the stimulus to make your muscle think, shit, I've got to rebuild and rebuild better, bigger, faster, because she's going to do this to me again.
Exactly.
So, you know, it's very, very expensive, and people don't actually realize it, because once they get into prep and they just start going, oh, I'm just going to drop out all of my compounds. Actually, that's a really good thing. I'll ask your opinion on that one. A lot of people are starting to say that as soon as they get into a marginal deficit and they start losing quite frequently, as in like a week on week, for example, they tend to want to kind of get rid of the big compound movements. Would you agree with that, or would you kind of keep them in as long as possible?
Like, I presume when you mean compound movements, like multi-joint movements that have higher neurological demands, like a deadlift or a squat, for example.
Exactly, especially the deadlift. People tend to kind of like, they see that one as like the big killer.
The only reason why you potentially pull it out and the time in which you do it are going to be when you're at a body fat level and you're at a place where if you were to go into the gym and do one of those sessions, it's going to compromise your ability to perform for the rest of the week.
Yeah.
And everyone's going to have been there where they're progressing a deadlift within off season because everything else is where it needs to be and all variables are aligned. It works and it clicks and it feels amazing and you progress and you enjoy the lift and things move forwards. When you're 4 weeks out from a show and that deadlift is now posing a risk of you staying in an injury-free state, or it's posing a risk at you, if you bury yourself on that set of deadlifts, it's going to ruin the entire rest of the session. And it's going to ruin the next 2 days of training. Is it worth it having there based on the value we're going to get back from that lift? Probably not. No. So there'll always be a time when prep comes where it literally comes to the point of, you know, the risk of the lift being in there in the first place relative to the kind of the muscular output you're going to get from that lift in return and the tension you can create in that lift. And also the neurological impacts that lift will have on the rest of the training week. And as soon as the risks outweigh the rewards, that lift goes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I've heard a lot about the hip thrust doing exactly the same thing in an off season rather than just a prep. So an actual weighted barbell hip thrust. Does the risk outweigh the reward, or have you seen women actually perform them very, very well from an offset? Because it's one of the exercises that I actually get my clients when they do them. I ask them to video them every single week. Yeah. Because the minute they want to put on an additional weight plate, that's it, their form goes. They don't feel a contraction, they don't get the full stretch stimulus as well, or they're too high on a bench. That's another thing that really pisses me off, actually. They just don't get their leverages right. But yeah, is there any particular exercise that kind of grinds your gears a little bit because people don't actually look at the risk versus reward aspect?
I think in what I've just said, like probably the most relative exercise that we're looking at, or bunch of exercises that we're looking at, will be any any challenge which exposes the spine to forces that it potentially can't manage once you're at a lighter body weight, or you're tired at the end of prep, and it just poses too much risk. Like something like a barbell hip extension, where we're not directly loading the spine, we're just placing a challenge through hip extension. Like that movement can be performed in a pretty safe capacity. But when we look at like challenging the spine in a deadlift and through that plane, like that creates a lot more risk, because we're now A, having a lot more joints in play, and we're B, creating a lot more stress and kind of challenge the integrity of the spine through that lift. So like the big ones for me would be squat variations with a barbell or a Smith machine or whatever. Machine squat variations where the spine is supported is completely different.
Yeah.
But any kind of deadlifting variations or pulling variations, like we just need to be very, very accurate with execution and loading. And we need to be very, very realistic with like our ability to maintain strength on those lifts as we get deeper into a deficit and you get more tired. And B, people don't want to be neurally frying themselves 3 weeks out from a show, because that time frame where you're getting closer to a show needs to be the time where you're actually pulling back volume, because the goal is not to build muscle anymore. The goal is to just retain muscle. And that realistically should be happening the whole way through prep. As soon as you're in an energy deficit, and as soon as fat loss is the main goal, the tissue that you built in prep is what you're using now. You're not trying to grow tissue in a prep. Your goal is to retain as much lean tissue as possible and maximize the process of lipolysis, or the process of fat loss, whilst holding on to as much tissue as you can. And your training needs to reflect that. And realistically, if somebody can train with intensity, they'd be shocked at the amount of volume they can get away with whilst retaining tissue. And it's relatively low. Like this can be very, very low if you know how to apply yourself in the gym. Your execution's on point and your intensity's on point. But we've all had clients, and we can all think of clients where we know they're a little bit soft in the gym. We know that their intensity isn't quite there. And you will need to use tool as a variable to create the response you want, because intensity is just not going to warrant the level of output you need to get them as lean as you want them to be. I can't tell someone that can't generate intensity and can't work hard and put themselves in uncomfortable situations to do an 8-set leg workout, because that will literally accrue nothing. Like nothing. It will have to be 16 or 18 sets of them going through the motions and using volume. But your ability to identify that as a coach is going to be your biggest kind of either advantage or downfall there. Which then comes into why programming needs to be individual, and you need to be tracking this stuff, because you can't put a blanket statement on how to prep someone generically.
No, absolutely. And that's the best thing that you can take away from this, actually, is that programming does have to be insanely individual. Now, I am actually going to swap the conversation and say, in terms of like a blanket kind of thing, what I see a lot and what I hear a lot of as well is that women, when they start to prep, their upper body gets lean very, very quickly. Yeah. And then it comes a onward battle of trying to get their lower body lean, but without detrimenting any tissue up top. Is that something that you see quite often? And if that is the case, how do you get around that? So, like, when we look at like the actual fat site from a cellular level, when we look at fat storage patterns and the distribution of adipocytes and alpha receptor dominance in different tissues around the body, we've got receptors at the fat cell, which will be, or even circulation, tissues with circulation that are poor are going to be harder to get lean. And we've got, fatty-ocytes that have greater levels of adipocytes or greater levels of alpha receptor dominance for the females, and kind of listening to this, it will generally speaking be the lower body, hamstrings, glutes, etc. For males, we might look at a greater distribution through their umbilical or like their suprailiac, the hip or the lower back. That's generally what you see, from a generic perspective. Like bringing scale weight down is the only surefire way we know how to bring fat mass down as well. Like there's no proven way to be site specific in terms of fat loss. It's not going to be possible. We can use certain things to our advantage, like oral or topical yohimbins and certain oral topical certain creams like Vasoburn with or like yohimbin and capsium and heating agents to offer us some form of benefit, but ultimately fat loss is happening because of the energy deficit there. When it comes to the female lower body, and when it comes to, depends what obviously
fed and class they're in. But generally speaking, whether it's bikini or bodybuilding, lower body mass and lower body tissue is regardless of the class. And generally speaking, the harder we diet and the higher either lower body volume or lower body output goes. And when I say lower body output, I mean like actual cardio, which is taxing the lower body as well. The higher that goes and the less the recovery side is managed poorly, the quicker we're going to start to lose tissue. And that's going to come like, even from the perspective of getting into the depths of preps and knowing when to pull back training volume, when to potentially pull back cardio and output, or when to change the form of that output, and when to top someone up in regards to food, and the visual side of actually being able to see when someone needs a top up with food. Those little decisions will ultimately collectively create that final look. And that only comes with experience. And that comes with, like, from a coaching perspective, like messing it up a few times to then be able to get it right in the future. And going through a few people and thinking, right, I probably made the wrong decision there and I'm going to learn from it. So a year down the line, you can always make the right decision. And it'll be very, very hard to start with until you've seen more bodies and more bloody new check-in photos on your phone. You start to get better and better at these decisions. But it's a very individual thing. And it takes a skilled eye to make those decisions. And the coaches that are doing the best in this are the ones that have seen the most bodies, that have worked with the most people, that have worked with the most personalities. And coaching is not a science to an extent. It's an art, and that art comes from experience. And I quite like that, because we're going to this kind of, we're going to the nth degree of promoting like an evidence-based industry, which is fantastic, and we should be using literature and research to guide our decision making. But you look at some of the best coaches in the world, and these guys are not the ones that are spouting out studies and looking at literature for every decision they make. It comes from experience. So a great coach is a myriad and a blend of both. And from a prep perspective, the best contest prep coaches are going to be the ones that have seen the most bodies and have made the most mistakes to be able to start making the right decisions at the right time.
Definitely. That's a really, really lovely note to finish it on, actually, which I think is absolutely phenomenal. And just a quick one, obviously going from that, and this is just from your complete perspective as well, and your opinion. Yeah. So obviously you've been in the industry for a long time. You've been following some really good coaches, anecdotal coaches, as well as scientifically based coaches as well. Who would be your top 3 coaches to sit around a dinner table with?
Oh, that's a very good question.
And they can be dead or alive.
Wow. I'm not sure I know any dead coaches, to be honest. Right, okay. I'm going to think about this one. Give me a minute. From a learning perspective, one individual would be Luke Lehman from the Muscle Nerds, just from the perspective that he has incredible banter and he's extremely knowledgeable. And probably the Muscle Nerds course was the first time a couple of years ago where I kind of got enlightened to the importance of a lot of these things in terms of the importance of stress management and sleep and how that impacts physiology. And that's where I kind of first kind of lit the spark to learn about more of this stuff. So that's a good one. For people that want to learn on more of a deeper level, and it's not to say that you need to do that, but you'll have all seen Dr. Dean, the mad Irish scientist, is going to be someone that you want to look up and learn from. And if he wasn't my business partner, I'd probably say Luke as well.
So why would you say Luke? You've given a reason behind the other 2, but why would you say Luke?
Like just from the perspective of the reason why we work so well as a unit business-wise is people have strengths in different areas. But just from an individual that has strengths over all aspects of coaching, from a mechanics perspective, but also a nutritional perspective as well, there'll be very few people that you'll meet that will have a broader knowledge base than Luke has. I wouldn't tell him that in person. I've just said it in a podcast, but
we can hush it out. It's
we can
fine.
hush, this cancel that out.
We can put that one out.
No, it's true.
Brilliant. No, I love it. I really love it. So in terms of closing off the podcast then for me, Calum, can you just let everybody know where they can find you, and if you have any space for coaching and or consultations or what have you?
Yeah, so Instagram, it's literally just Calum at the Muscle Mentors, all lower score. The business Instagram, which we haven't really done much with, it's just kind of on our individual Instagrams, is just the Muscle Mentors. Luke, James, and Ryan are the same, just the first name and then the Muscle Mentors. We're in the process of launching a members website, which will have a lot of educational stuff on, and kind of an online platform to mentor personal trainers and coaches through what we love and what we're all passionate about. And we have our kind of year of education in terms of the courses that we're running this year are going to be announced probably tomorrow, so this week. So when the podcast is announced, it will be around the same time that we're launching the exact dates, which this year, to start with, will be held at Ultimate Fitness in Birmingham. So yeah, that's pretty much it.
Brilliant. So I'll put all of those links underneath or in here on the show notes, guys, and on the YouTube channel. And if you've got any questions at all for Calum or myself or the other guys at the Muscle Mentors, then obviously just put them in the comments and we will get back to you ASAP. So that is it from me. It is it from Calum. I am back next week with another podcast with another amazing guest, because we're going to get back into the swing of these things now that I have now got a good schedule free in order to do them. So thank you very much for joining in, guys, and we will speak to you very, very soon. Thank you, Calum. Take care now.
My pleasure.